Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Tonight, a single question glows faintly in the dark. How can a man who wrote nothing, taught nothing formally, and claimed to know nothing be one of the greatest minds in history? This is the strange story of Socrates. He did not call himself a teacher. He had no school, no books, no doctrine. He wandered the streets of Athens in sandals and a rough cloak, asking questions. Only questions. And yet, the way he asked them changed everything. His life ended with a cup of poison, but his voice still echoes quietly, like footsteps in a long hallway of thought. What made him so dangerous? Why did the city feel it had to silence him? It began not with brilliance, but with irritation. Socrates was a stone in the sandal of Athens. He stopped people mid-stride, asked them what they believed, and then, very gently, ask them why. What is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? At first it seemed innocent, but something eerie happened when people tried to answer. Their words unraveled, their beliefs thinned. The more they spoke, the less they seemed to know. It was like talking into a mirror that slowly turned to smoke. This quiet unraveling became known as the Socratic method, a strange kind of questioning that didn't aim to fill the mind, but empty it, strip away false certainty, make space for something honest. Socrates believed wisdom began with one thing, realizing how little one knows. "I know that I know nothing," he said, and it wasn't false humility, it was an unsettling truth. While others walked around certain of their ideas, Socrates held his mind like an open hand. He wasn't trying to win, he wasn't trying to prove, he was trying to wake something up. His questions weren't casual, they cut. He would ask a proud man what justice was, and within minutes, the man would contradict himself, again and again. Socrates didn't mock, he didn't insult, but he didn't let go either. He kept turning the thought in his hands, slowly, like a stone being worn smooth by water. And often, when he was done, the person walked away humbler, or angry, sometimes both. What kind of mind seeks only to unmask, not to instruct, not to preach, just to press gently until the illusion cracks? Plato, one of his students, compared him to a gadfly, a small irritating insect that stings the great horse of the state. He didn't start revolutions, he didn't tear down the temples, but he asked the kind of questions that made people question themselves. And that was more dangerous than any sword. Because once someone starts to doubt what they believe, once the cracks form, no law, no God, no title can patch it back together. Socrates believed that an unexamined life was not worth living, and that belief, quietly repeated through calm conversations and barefoot wanderings, became a threat to the entire Athenian order. He was accused of corrupting the youth, of introducing strange gods, of sowing doubt where there should be obedience. But what if the real fear was not what he taught, but what he revealed? That most people didn't know why they believed what they believed, that their confidence was borrowed, that their morals were memorized. Socrates didn't offer answers, he offered discomfort. He made the city see itself not as wise and free, but unsure and afraid. And so they gave him a trial. Not for murder, not for theft, but for thinking too deeply, and they sentenced him to death, to drink hemlock. He didn't run, he didn't beg, he didn't curse the court. He calmly drank the poison and talked about the soul. Even as the numbness crept upward, he spoke softly of what may come after, of how death might be a dreamless sleep, or a journey to speak with other wise souls. He met death the same way he met life, with a question. And in doing so, he left a riddle behind. Why do we fear the one who seeks the truth more than those who lie with confidence? That's the legacy of Socrates. He taught nothing, but he made minds move. He turned conversation into philosophy, and his silence, in the end, said more than volumes ever could. Socrates was not a man of secrets, yet everything about him remains mysterious. He left no writings, built no school, and claimed no wisdom. Everything we know about him comes from others, from Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes. But even those accounts contradict each other. Was he a saint, a trickster, a martyr for reason, or a menace to the state? The truth, like all truths, lives in the space between. What we do know is this: he changed the shape of philosophy not by offering answers but by dismantling the questioner. The Socratic method was not an invention, it was an infection, a quiet unravelling, a mirror held to the mind that refused to flatter. Socrates would walk slowly through the agora, approach a respected man, and ask a single, innocent-sounding question. What is justice? What is love? What is courage? And as the man answered, Socrates would gently press further. Is that always true? What if the opposite happens? How do you know? His voice was calm, his tone patient, but the effect was unsettling, because the more the man spoke, the more his definitions collapsed. What began as confidence dissolved into confusion. This was the power of elenchus, the method of refutation. Not to humiliate, not to defeat, but to show the cracks that were already there. He didn't mock ignorance, he illuminated it, and by doing so, exposed the most dangerous idea of all, that wisdom begins where certainty ends. Why did this frighten people? Because it stripped away comfort. It left no place to hide behind tradition or authority. Socrates didn't tell people what to think. He made them realize how little they had thought at all. In modern psychology, this process echoes what Carl Jung called shadow work, facing the unconscious parts of the self, those beliefs and biases we deny. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Socrates lived that principle. He turned every dialogue into a soft excavation, not of facts, but of self-deception. The Socratic method works because the human ego is fragile and inflated. We think in assumptions, we speak in slogans, we believe for the sake of comfort, not truth. Socrates, like a quiet mirror, made people hear themselves without distortion. And what they heard was often hollow. That kind of clarity feels cruel, but it is a deeper kindness, like the way a surgeon must cut in order to heal. In the trial that sentenced him to death, Socrates did not plead for mercy. He said he was a gift from the gods, a gadfly sent to sting the city from its moral slumber. He compared himself to a midwife of the soul, delivering others of ideas but claiming none for himself. This metaphor was not flattery, it was disarming. It reframed philosophy not as a set of truths but as a process of becoming less false. In that courtroom, surrounded by men terrified of his influence, he spoke the quietest rebellion imaginable, that the highest good was not obedience but self-examination. He stood against a culture obsessed with appearances, with reputation, with pride, and simply asked, "Are you sure?" That question remains, like a whisper beneath every modern conversation. In law, in science, in politics, the Socratic spirit haunts every field that dares to question itself. But the method is not without danger. Nietzsche, centuries later, would blame Socrates for the sickness of the West, saying he made reason a tyrant, drained life of its instincts, and turned passion into guilt. Was Socrates a liberator or a corrupter? A light in the dark or a fire that consumed its own city? The Athenians, in the end, chose silence over the sting. They chose comfort over awakening. And yet, his questions survived. They outlived the empire. They crossed centuries. And today, they remain alive in every honest conversation. In every moment someone stops, hesitates, and wonders if what they believe is truly their own. There is a strange irony in how Socrates lived and how he died. He who preached humility was accused of arrogance. He who taught virtue without teaching was called a corrupter of youth. He who claimed ignorance was feared as the most dangerous mind in Athens. But perhaps the real danger was never his questions, it was the mirror he held up. Socrates made people see themselves without the armour of custom. He revealed not evil, but emptiness. a well-dressed man who speaks of justice but cannot define it, a respected general who praises courage yet trembles at contradiction. These were not villains, they were ordinary, and that was the most terrifying part. Socrates exposed the common man's unthinking confidence, and the city, feeling its foundations tremble, chose to silence the mirror. In the days leading to his death, his friends urged him to flee. They had bribed the guards, they could smuggle him out, but Socrates refused, not out of pride, not from martyrdom, but because, he said, to escape would be to break the very laws he claimed to respect. He asked, "If I have benefited from the city's laws all my life, do I now reject them because they no longer favour me?" He imagined the laws as living voices questioning him, and he answered them not with resistance, but with surrender. This moment, quiet, rational, unwavering, is perhaps the clearest expression of his philosophy. That the soul's integrity matters more than the body's safety. That consistency is the highest virtue, even in the face of death. This echoes a principle in psychology known as cognitive dissonance, the tension felt when actions and beliefs diverge. Most resolve it by bending the truth, justifying, excusing, but Socrates resolved it by aligning with the truth, no matter the cost. In the prison cell, he spent his final hours in conversation, still questioning, still reflecting. When the cup of hemlock was brought, he didn't flinch. He drank it calmly, as if it were just another argument. As his limbs numbed and his body fell still, his mind remained untouched, serene, present, whole. Plato, who was not there but later recorded the scene, described his last words. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it is paid." A simple line, but eerie in its layers. Asclepius was the god of healing. The rooster was an offering made by those who had recovered. Why would a dying man offer thanks for healing? Perhaps Socrates believed that death was not an end, but a cure, for illusion, for ignorance, for the body itself, or perhaps it was a final joke, a wink at the gods, a last riddle whispered as the soul slipped away. What makes this moment so haunting is its calmness. No outburst, no fear, just silence, just stillness, as if death itself were part of the lesson, as if the man who questioned everything had finally received his only answer. And yet even then he did not speak of certainty. He did not claim to know what came after. He only accepted it. There is power in that acceptance. It is not resignation, it is not despair, it is alignment with the unknown, with the inevitable, with the mysterious current of life that carries us forward, even as we try to cling to the shore. Socrates showed that philosophy is not a game of the clever. It is not a shield for the educated. It is a way of being, a discipline of honesty, a devotion to the soul's clarity. And in this clarity he found peace. His enemies won the trial, but they lost the memory. Socrates became larger in death than he had ever been in life. His method spread like ink in water, through Plato, through Aristotle, through the very veins of Western thought. Even those who rejected him could not escape his shape. Nietzsche hated him, but could not stop speaking of him. Kierkegaard called him his only true teacher. Even modern science, when it questions assumptions and tests beliefs, carries a flicker of Socratic light. He was not a prophet, not a god, not even a teacher. He was something stranger, a quiet flame, a living question, a man who taught the world how to think, not by giving answers, but by showing how false answers feel. Imagine living in a city where conversation itself was considered dangerous. Athens, in the golden age of democracy, revered poets, playwrights, warriors. It worshipped beauty and rhetoric. But Socrates did not speak in poems. He didn't tell stories. He didn't fight wars. He walked slowly, barefoot, asking plain questions that felt like small cracks in the wall. He wasn't loud, he wasn't charming, but he disturbed people, not because he insulted them, but because he saw through them, through their words, through their borrowed wisdom. through their unexamined lives. He had no doctrine, no temple, no fees. Yet he gathered followers, not by charisma, but by something deeper, by creating discomfort that felt honest. Plato was among them. So was Alcibiades, the beautiful and reckless general. So was Xenophon, the soldier-writer. These were not timid minds. They were drawn to the stillness inside Socrates, drawn to the silence that followed his questions. They saw that this man, who claimed to know nothing, knew how to unmask the world, and maybe, just maybe, himself. But the city saw something else. They saw his influence on the youth, the way boys began to question their fathers, the way loyalty shifted from tradition to thought. Socrates never told anyone what to believe, but belief itself began to tremble under his presence. That's what made him dangerous. The way a mirror makes a lie visible. He didn't need to touch politics to shake the foundations of power. Just ask enough questions and the pillars start to wobble. What is piety? What is honor? What is truth? The questions sound innocent, even polite, but they are blades made of breath, and breath, when sharp enough, can cut through empires. The Athenian court charged him with two things: corrupting the youth and introducing strange gods. But beneath the words, the accusation was simpler. He made us unsure. And in a culture that prized certainty in the gods, in the polis, in the moral order, that was the gravest crime. Modern thinkers have traced this dynamic across time. Hannah Arendt, studying the roots of totalitarianism, observed that authoritarian systems fear thought, not protest, but thought. Because protest can be crushed, but thought spreads, it seeps, it lingers, it cannot be exiled, imprisoned, or silenced by force. And Socrates, with his simple questions, was thought made human. He did not seek to convert. He did not argue to win. He asked only that people examine themselves. And for many, that was unbearable. There's a quiet cruelty in self-knowledge. To see clearly what one is, not what one claims to be, not what one hopes to appear, but what truly stirs beneath the surface. Socrates made people feel that, not by scolding, but by listening, and in the silence that followed, their own words betrayed them. That's the mark of real dialogue. When it doesn't just change what you say, it changes how you think, or exposes that you haven't really thought at all. The city, perhaps, feared that most of all, that its citizens were living on borrowed ideas, that beneath the marble and glory there was confusion, pretense, habit. Socrates lit a quiet lantern and pointed to the dust, not to shame, but to see. And when the city smashed the lantern, it only made the shadows grow. It's strange, isn't it, that a man with no weapons, no followers, no ambition could make the most powerful city in Greece feel small. He didn't demand change, he didn't overthrow kings, he simply asked why. And from that question, everything else unraveled. Socrates did not write because he believed truth should not be frozen. He feared that once written, a thought becomes rigid, lifeless, immune to challenge. Dialogue, to him, was alive, a dance between minds, a flame passed hand to hand. He believed real understanding came not from memorizing conclusions, but from struggling with contradictions, from wrestling ideas until the false ones crumbled and the true ones perhaps never appeared. But something was left, a shape, an outline, a clarity born not from certainty, but from the ashes of confusion. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates always questions more than he answers. It's like watching a man build a ladder only to kick it away once someone climbs it. His goal was never to lift people up, but to make them realize how shallow the ground was beneath their feet. One of his most famous exchanges is in the dialogue Euthyphro. There Socrates meets a man who claims to understand piety. The man is about to prosecute his own father for murder, a controversial act, even in democratic Athens. Socrates, gently curious, asks, is what's pious loved by the gods because it's pious, or is it pious because it's loved by the gods? It's a quiet trap. a paradox that still puzzles minds today. The question shakes the foundation of divine morality. If gods love good things because they are good, then goodness exists independently of gods. But if things are good only because gods love them, then morality is arbitrary, dependent on divine whim. Either answer disturbs, and that was the point. Socrates didn't aim to resolve. He aimed to awaken. He showed that even our most sacred values, justice, love, faith, collapse under scrutiny if never truly examined, and yet he never scorned belief. He simply believed that belief must earn its place by being tested, not accepted blindly, not repeated like a hymn. This approach deeply influenced later thinkers. Kierkegaard admired Socrates not for his conclusions, but for his method. He called him the ironist, the man who destroys illusions without offering replacements. Nietzsche, too, was fascinated, though in a darker way. He saw Socrates as the beginning of the West's obsession with reason over instinct, dialectic over life. Socrates is the turning point, Nietzsche wrote. He made thinking into a disease. Was he right? Did Socrates infect us with a kind of paralysis, an endless questioning that robs us of the ability to act? Or did he liberate us from the prisons of unearned certainty? The tension remains. And maybe that's the deepest truth Socrates revealed, that thought itself is a burden and a blessing, a fire that lights and burns. Socrates never claimed to be wise. He said he was like a midwife, helping others give birth to ideas but offering none of his own. He compared the soul to a seed, buried under layers of falsehood and ego. His questions were the digging, the sun, the water, sometimes harsh, always necessary, and yet not everyone blooms. Some resist, some cover themselves in thicker layers. Socrates knew this. He knew that truth is not something given, but discovered. And not everyone wants to discover. Most want to be assured, soothed, left unshaken. But he could not offer that, only the opposite, a kind of sacred disturbance, one that made the world feel unstable, yet more honest, one that left people not with answers, but with the rarest gift in a loud world, a silent mind that finally begins to wonder. The Socratic method was never about winning, it was about undoing assumptions, undoing pride, undoing the comfort of thinking one knows. In every exchange, Socrates peeled away the layers of certainty like old skin, until what was left wasn't knowledge, but humility. That humility, to him, was the birthplace of wisdom. But to others, it felt like humiliation. Many who spoke with Socrates left not enlightened, but irritated. There was something almost surgical in the way he spoke. He never raised his voice. He never pushed, but his calmness made the cut deeper. He used words like a scalpel, thin, precise, deliberate. He exposed what people believed without realizing they believed it. That was the real power. Most of us don't hold beliefs. We're held by them, gripped by ideas passed down from parents, priests, teachers, the culture around us. We wear these beliefs like skin, never questioning where they came from. Socrates saw that. He asked, "When did you begin to believe this? Who told you it was true? Have you ever lived a day without it?" These questions didn't dismantle ideas. They dismantled identity. And for many, that was intolerable. It still is. In modern psychology, this disruption is known as schema violation. A schema is a mental framework, a filter we use to interpret the world. When reality violates the schema, the brain resists. It fights back. It defends the old map, even if the terrain has changed. Socrates weaponized this resistance. He made people confront the cracks in their mental maps. Not to mock them, but to lead them, gently, quietly, to a place of unknowing. And that unknowing was sacred. In the dialogue Meno, a boy with no formal education is questioned by Socrates about geometry. Through only questions, no teaching, the boy arrives at the answer himself. Socrates calls this anamnesis, or recollection. The soul, he says, already holds knowledge, it only needs to be awakened. This echoes ancient Eastern philosophy as well. In the Upanishads, knowledge is not gained, it is remembered. Enlightenment is not about adding, it is about removing illusion. Socrates, though rooted in the West, danced with this idea. He believed that the soul longs not for more information, but for clarity. Not to know more, but to see better. This kind of knowing is slow. It cannot be forced. It blooms like a flower at night, quietly, without applause. But it is rare, and because it is rare, it is feared. In a world obsessed with certainty, Socratic doubt feels like a threat. Yet it is the very doorway to depth. Socrates was accused of being a sophist, a manipulator of words. But sophists taught for money. They taught to win. Socrates did not charge. He did not claim to know. And he never sought victory. He sought honesty. He knew that real thought is not a sword, but a mirror. It does not cut, it reflects. And what one sees in that reflection can never be unseen. That was his quiet revolution. To turn the gaze inward, to make the self the subject of scrutiny. Not the gods, not the state, not the enemy, but the self. In doing so, he shifted the axis of philosophy forever, from the stars to the soul, from the cosmos to the conscience. And in that shift, a new kind of fire was lit. Not one that burns buildings, but one that slowly, patiently, burns away illusion. Socrates often compared himself to a gadfly, small, annoying, persistent. He said Athens was like a great horse, noble but sluggish, needing to be stirred. His questions were the sting, not to wound, but to wake. And yet, what does it say about a society when its greatest threat is not a soldier, not a criminal, but a questioner? The trial of Socrates was not just a legal proceeding, it was a mirror held to a city losing its grip on truth. He stood accused of impiety and corrupting the youth, but those were shadows. The real charge was disruption, not of laws but of comfort, the comfort of believing that the gods smiled on Athens, that the democracy was wise, that the elders knew best. Socrates didn't attack these beliefs directly. He simply asked people to explain them, and in doing so, he revealed their hollowness. This discomfort festered, like a splinter beneath the skin. Eventually, it had to be removed. Socrates' execution was less about justice and more about equilibrium. The city wanted peace, certainty, consensus, and Socrates, with his quiet gaze and endless questions, made that impossible. He was found guilty by a narrow margin. Then something strange happened. He was invited to suggest his own punishment. In Athenian trials, the convicted could propose an alternative to the state sentence. Most would plead for exile or a fine. Socrates, without irony, proposed that he be rewarded, that he should be fed at public expense like Olympic victors or civic heroes. This was not arrogance, it was reflection. He believed he had served the city, kept it awake, forced it to think. To him, that was the highest public service, but to the jurors, it sounded like mockery. And so, by a wider margin than his guilty vote, they sentenced him to death. In that moment, something irreversible occurred. Athens, the city of reason, murdered its philosopher for reasoning too well. Centuries later, this moment still echoes. It has become a symbol of how societies punish those who ask the wrong questions. Galileo, Hypatia, Mandela, each in their own time, became a mirror too clear to be tolerated. The execution of Socrates was not the end of a man, it was the beginning of a haunting. The method he taught, the art of unmasking, could not be buried. Because once a mind has been opened by a question, it cannot fully close again. That is the terror and the gift of philosophy. It makes certainty impossible, but awareness inescapable. Even the disciples who watched him die, Plato chief among them, did not stop questioning. They carried his method forward, sharpened it, spread it. Socrates' death became their proof that truth cannot be killed. It can be delayed, denied, but not undone. This is why Socrates never fled. He could have escaped into exile, vanished into safety, but he stayed. He drank the poison, not because he believed in martyrdom, but because to run would be to contradict everything he lived for. If virtue mattered, then it must matter when inconvenient. If laws mattered, they must matter when unjust. If philosophy mattered, it must matter most at the edge of death. His calm acceptance wasn't submission, it was his final act of integrity, a final lesson delivered not in words, but in silence, in stillness, in a cup raised without trembling. That is why we still speak his name. Not because he was perfect, not because he was right, but because he made thinking a form of courage, and because he showed that even the smallest question, softly asked, can outlast an empire. There is a soft tragedy in the way Socrates died, calm, composed, almost invisible, a man surrounded by friends, speaking gently as the poison climbed his limbs. No panic, no screams, just thought until the end. He had always insisted the soul was more important than the body. Now he was proving it. In his final hours he continued what he had always done, questioning, reflecting, stripping illusions from truth. Plato's account of his death in the Phaedo reads not like a tragedy, but like a quiet ritual. A man saying goodbye, not with fear, but with clarity. What kind of mind can meet death with questions? What kind of man dies more curious than afraid? Socrates believed that philosophy was a preparation for death, not because it offered escape, but because it taught detachment. A philosopher, he said, spends his life trying to separate soul from body, valuing truth over pleasure, clarity over comfort. So when death finally comes, the philosopher is ready, already half absent from the material world, already leaning toward the eternal. It's a strange belief, but there's something profound in it, something that touches even those who don't share his metaphysics. Because beneath the idea of the soul is a deeper truth, that our lives are shaped not by what we face, but by how we face it. Socrates faced death with the same posture he faced life, thoughtful, open, still, and in that stillness he offered one last lesson, not in logic, but in being. It's easy to admire the Socratic method from a distance, to imagine it as academic, intellectual, safe, but it was never safe. It was dangerous. It stripped people of pride. It revealed their ignorance, and in a society where image was everything, that was unbearable. Athens, for all its brilliance, was fragile. It needed myths, needed certainty, needed to believe it was wise. Socrates questioned that belief until it cracked. And when it cracked, they called him a threat. Today, we look back and see the irony. But how different are we really? Do we not still silence those who ask uncomfortable questions? Do we not still prefer comfort over clarity? The world remembers Socrates because he didn't bend, because he showed that thought could be more powerful than violence, and because in the end, he showed that how a person dies can reveal more than how they lived. His death raised a quiet mirror, not just to Athens, but to every civilization that would follow. What do we do when someone asks us why we believe what we believe? Do we listen? Do we reflect? Or do we reach for the hemlock? That question has never gone away. It lingers in courtrooms and classrooms, in arguments and silences, in the quiet space between a claim and a question. Socrates lives there, not as a man, but as a method, as a way of seeing, of undoing, of waking. And once that method touches a mind, it changes it forever. Not by adding, but by subtracting, by taking away what was false, so that something true, if only a little, might remain. His death was not an end. It was a transmission of courage, of clarity, of a simple, radical idea that the most powerful thing a human can do is ask why. Centuries have passed since Socrates walked the dusty stones of Athens, yet his method still stirs in lecture halls, courtrooms, therapy rooms, even quiet conversations between friends who dare to be honest. His legacy is not a temple or a scripture, it is a question, and the method of asking it. The Socratic method lives wherever doubt is treated not as failure, but as progress. Wherever someone pauses, not to argue, but to reflect. Wherever someone dares to say, "I don't know," and means it, that moment of not knowing is sacred, because it is the only place from which something real can begin. This is what modern psychology has come to understand as well. Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, believed that deep change only happens in the presence of radical acceptance and sincere inquiry. Not in advice, not in instruction, but in listening and gentle questioning. The therapist does not heal. They invite the person to discover their own inner truth. Socrates did something similar. He trusted that the soul, if gently prodded, would reveal itself. Not through explanation, but through honest confusion, through seeing where one's beliefs no longer hold. This process is uncomfortable. The mind resists, it tightens, it deflects. But if the questioning continues, softly, persistently, something begins to loosen. This is the strange magic of the Socratic method. It is not a debate, it is a dismantling, not to destroy, but to clarify. And in that clarity, the soul becomes visible. Strip away the borrowed answers, the memorized truths, the reflexive opinions, and what's left? A self blinking in the light. That blinking self is the beginning of wisdom. It is fragile, it is unsure, but it is awake. And awakening, as Socrates knew, is not always welcome. Even today, the world often resists the kind of thought he inspired. We admire critical thinking in theory, but in practice it disrupts, it questions authority, it slows decisions, it reveals bias, it undermines certainty. That's why it's easier to teach facts than to teach thinking. Facts can be memorized. Thinking must be lived, it must be modelled, it must be risked. Socrates risked it daily, and ultimately it cost him his life. But he never stopped, even when threatened, even when condemned. Even with the poison in his hand, he asked questions. Because to him, philosophy was not an idea, it was a way of being. This is what made him more than a teacher, it made him a mirror. One that didn't reflect what people wanted to see, but what was truly there. And in that reflection, some saw the truth, others saw only threat. Both reactions are still alive today. Every time a young student challenges a professor, every time a citizen questions a law, every time a person looks inward and realizes they've been lying to themselves, Socrates is there, not in spirit, but in method. Quiet, patient, dangerous, alive. He left no doctrines, but he left a path. Not one to be followed, but one to be cleared again and again. Through questions, through doubt, through the soft, trembling light of unknowing. Socrates lived in a time of transition, a city caught between myth and reason, tradition and doubt. The Peloponnesian War had shaken Athens to its core. Old values no longer fit. Heroes became flawed. Gods seemed silent. And into this uncertainty stepped a man who asked questions with the gentleness of a whisper and the precision of a blade. He didn't claim answers. He didn't offer hope. He only asked, and in doing so, revealed how shallow the waters were beneath the polished surface of Athenian pride. It's no wonder he unsettled the city. In times of uncertainty, people cling to certainty like a raft. Socrates gently took the raft away and pointed to the water. Swim, he seemed to say. Think. But swimming requires courage, and courage of the mind is rarer than physical bravery. Most would rather drown in belief than float in doubt. That's the quiet sorrow behind the Socratic legacy. He wasn't killed for crime, he was killed for clarity, because he showed people what they didn't want to see, that their confidence was unearned, that their virtue was mimicry, that their gods were inherited, not understood. The philosopher in any age, risks this fate. Not because philosophy is threatening, but because it reveals how fragile the mind can be when it stands on borrowed ground. Modern psychology echoes this. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people with low ability often overestimate their competence. Socrates exposed this centuries before science gave it a name. His questions revealed how those who claimed to know the most often knew the least, and the ones who admitted ignorance were the ones most capable of learning. That's the strange paradox of wisdom. It begins with humility. Socrates knew that. He made it his life's work. And because of that, he was both revered and hated. The youth loved him, the elders feared him, and between those poles, the city cracked. We like to imagine philosophy as a quiet, abstract pursuit, but Socrates showed that it's deeply political. Not because it tells people how to vote, but because it asks them why they believe what they do. And in asking that, it threatens every institution that survives on unthinking loyalty. The state, the church, the market, the family. None of these can tolerate too much reflection, because reflection slows obedience, it weakens reflex, it replaces pride with pause, and Socrates was a master of pause. He could turn a question into a silence so deep, it made people uncomfortable in their own minds. That silence was his weapon, and his gift. In that space, people glimpsed themselves, not as they wished to be, but as they were. And many turned away. But those who stayed, those who sat with the questions, who let go of certainty, who stepped into the fog of doubt, those were changed, not with answers, but with vision, with patience, with the courage to say, I don't know, but I want to find out. That, more than anything, was the essence of Socrates, not a teacher of truth, but a servant of the question, and through the question, the quiet guide to a deeper self. Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. It sounds harsh, almost cruel, but beneath the sharpness is a deep tenderness, a belief that life deserves to be seen, not just lived. That existence without reflection is a kind of sleep. He did not mean that every life must be full of books or theories. He meant that every soul deserves its own attention, its own question, its own mirror. Most people walk through their days surrounded by noise, duties, routines, inherited opinions. Socrates stepped into that noise and asked for stillness. He asked a man at the market, "What do you believe? Why do you trust it? How do you know it's true?" At first, the man would answer confidently. He'd quote laws, parents, traditions, but Socrates would nod and keep asking, not rudely, not to win, but to understand. And slowly, the man's words would twist back on themselves, like a snake biting its tail. Until he saw it, he had never truly thought it through. Socrates was not angry about this. He was fascinated, because each time a little more falsehood fell away, and something quieter took its place, a kind of honest confusion, a vulnerability. That moment, fragile and rare, was the beginning of philosophy. Not when someone learns, but when someone realizes how little they truly know. That realization is uncomfortable. Even now, thousands of years later, the instinct is to resist it. In debates, in relationships, in politics, people want to appear certain, because certainty looks strong. But Socrates showed that real strength is different. Real strength is the ability to live inside a question, to stand in the middle of uncertainty and not flinch. That's why the Socratic method is still used today, in law schools, in psychotherapy, in ethics training, because it doesn't impose, it reveals, it teaches not by filling the cup, but by emptying it. And in that emptiness, something real can grow. This emptiness is not blankness, it is potential. It is awareness without illusion. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, spoke of finding meaning even in suffering. He said between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose. Socrates lived in that space. His questions widened it, gave people a moment between belief and action, a breath, a pause, and in that pause they saw themselves. Some turned away, but others stayed, and in staying they became more human, less reactive, more reflective. That is the gift of Socratic thought, not wisdom handed down, but wisdom drawn out, like water from a deep well, and once tasted, it cannot be forgotten. It changes the thirst, it changes the soul. The figure of Socrates stands at the edge of two worlds, myth and history, flesh and idea. He was once just a man, short, plain, often called ugly by his peers, but somehow, over time, he became something else, a symbol of the thinking life, a name that outlived the very city that tried to erase him. What gives a man that kind of weight? It isn't power. He held no office. It isn't wealth. He owned little more than his thoughts. It isn't charm. Even his friends admitted he could be irritating. What gave Socrates his immortal gravity was something quieter, a commitment to truth that never bent, a patience that refused to flatter, and a kind of love, not for people as they were, but for what they could become if they truly thought. He never tried to change the world directly. He simply changed conversations, one at a time, gently, persistently, until those conversations began to change people. And those people, Plato, Xenophon, even Aristotle, who came later, carried that fire into the future. What started as quiet questions on Athenian streets became the architecture of Western thought. Epistemology, ethics, logic, they all trace back, like roots through stone, to this barefoot man who refused to lie to himself. But it wasn't a clean legacy. Even in his own time, people mocked him. Aristophanes, the playwright, portrayed him as a cloud-dwelling buffoon, lost in nonsense, corrupting youth. The line between philosopher and fool has always been thin, and Socrates knew that. He leaned into it. He called himself ignorant. He laughed at his own confusion. But the laughter was not empty. It was a form of resistance, a refusal to pretend. He didn't fear appearing wrong. He feared pretending to be right. And that honesty, though simple, was explosive. Because most of society depends on the opposite, on performance, on agreement, on the illusion that we understand what we're doing. Socrates peeled that illusion away, not with violence, but with questions. And in doing so, he revealed how many people build their lives on borrowed words, on ideas they've never tested, on scripts they recite without knowing the meaning. He wasn't angry at them. He understood. He simply asked, "Is that really yours?" That question, so soft, so small, can echo for years inside a person. It can keep them up at night. It can ruin pride, dissolve certainty, make the world look unfamiliar. But it can also open something, a space for real thought, real growth, real freedom. And Socrates gave that space to anyone who would stand still long enough to think with him. That, more than any philosophy, is his true legacy. The quiet courage to question everything, including oneself. Socrates did not fear contradiction. He lived inside it. He believed that to hold opposing thoughts, to sit with paradox, was not weakness, but the beginning of wisdom. In his conversations, contradictions were not errors. They were invitations. When someone said courage meant facing fear, but also that a reckless man was not courageous, Socrates did not correct them. He pressed, gently, until they saw the tension for themselves, until they had to choose, or admit the definition was not ready. Most people flee from contradiction. It feels like failure, like confusion. But Socrates knew it was a crack where light gets in, a sign that thought is happening. Real thought, not repetition, not mimicry, but struggle. There is something quietly sacred about that struggle. It's how a mind becomes its own, not by gathering more, but by letting go of what doesn't hold, of what doesn't survive the question. He wasn't trying to destroy belief. He was testing its roots, seeing which ones ran deep enough to stay. In this way, He treated the soul like a garden, not one to be filled with decorations, but one to be pruned, cleared, so that something strong and living could grow. That growth was often painful. Many hated him for it, and many still would, because he never gave comfort. He gave clarity, and clarity demands change, or honesty, or both. In therapy, this moment is called cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort when old beliefs no longer fit new truths. Most people resolve it by denying the truth, but a few lean in. They let the dissonance stretch them, break them, rebuild them. Socrates spoke to that rare part of the human mind, the part that wants to be remade, not protected, not praised, just remade, even if it means losing old certainties, old stories, old selves. That's the real danger of the Socratic method. It doesn't just change opinions, it changes identity. It whispers, "What if you're wrong?" and waits for what comes next. Some people dig in, others walk away, but some, just a few, stay. They listen. They let the silence widen, and in that silence, something stirs. A voice that isn't the cities, isn't the families, isn't the cultures, a voice that might be their own, or the soul, or truth. Socrates never named it, he only made room for it, and in that room, even now, a question waits. There's a haunting beauty in how Socrates framed ignorance, not as a shameful thing, but as the starting line of wisdom. He didn't pretend to know. He didn't bluff his way through mystery. He wore his uncertainty like a second skin, and in doing so, gave others permission to do the same. This was his quiet revolution. In a world that prized certainty and authority, he made ignorance noble, made doubt a discipline, and over time, it became contagious, not because he spread a doctrine, but because he modelled a way of being. There's a kind of gravity in someone who admits, without fear, that they don't know. It disarms, it disorients, especially in a culture where knowledge is currency. Socrates refused to spend counterfeit. He would rather say nothing than pretend to understand. And when he spoke, it was only to draw others out, to test the weight of their words. Were they speaking from habit, from fear, from borrowed ideas, or had they truly sat with the thought, lived it, fought with it alone in the dark? That was what he cared about. Not opinions, but their roots, the soil they grew from, whether they were alive or dead. In our world today, where opinions flash like signals in a storm, his silence feels more relevant than ever. The Socratic method is not a tool for winning debates. It's a compass for intellectual honesty, a way of measuring the soul's alignment with what it says it believes. It asks, do your words fit your actions? Do your thoughts survive their own echo? Are you speaking from knowledge or from noise? Socrates trained people to hear that difference, slowly, gently, sometimes painfully, and in that hearing, they often found themselves changed, not because he told them what to think, but because he showed them how to listen, not to him, but to their own mind, their own contradiction, their own tremble of doubt beneath the surface. That is the lasting power of his method. It's not an instruction, it's an invitation, a door that only opens from the inside. Even in his final moments, he asked questions, he listened, he searched, not for escape but for understanding. He was not trying to transcend the human condition, he was trying to face it, naked, unarmed, awake. And that is perhaps his greatest legacy, a kind of moral bravery, not to fight, not to rule, but to think, to risk being wrong, to speak plainly even when surrounded by pretense, to question everything, even oneself, and still walk calmly toward the unknown. Socrates never claimed to possess truth. He only claimed to seek it. That distinction, small and quiet, is what sets him apart from almost every voice before or since. He did not preach, he did not convert. He only wandered, listened, asked, and what he revealed, again and again, was that most people are terrified of not knowing. They build entire lives around what they've been told, what they've assumed, what they've never dared to question. Socrates met that fear with stillness, with patience, with the strange courage of a man who needed no answers to feel whole. He knew that the most dangerous belief is not a wrong one. It's the one never examined. That's why he made people uncomfortable, not because he insulted them, but because he took away their shield. The shield of confidence, the armour of opinion, and without it, they saw themselves, not as wise, not as noble, but as uncertain, contradictory, confused. He didn't shame them for it. He welcomed it, because he believed that moment, the moment when pretense collapses, is the beginning of the soul's real work. And maybe that's what made him immortal. Not his mind, sharp as it was, not his death, poetic as it was, but his method. His gentle way of asking, until truth became not a destination, but a direction. A compass hidden inside the self. His questions echo not just through philosophy, but through every discipline that values clarity over certainty. Science asks, how do we know? Therapy asks, what do we feel beneath the story? Art asks, what is real beneath the form? All are branches of the same tree, a tree rooted in doubt, in honesty, in the slow, sacred work of looking inward. Socrates never wrote, but he was written, by those who loved him, by those he challenged, by history itself, which could not forget the man who said so little, and yet revealed so much. His life was not glamorous, his death was not heroic, but both were complete, aligned, undivided. He lived his questions and died without betraying them. And that is rare in any age, in any soul. The Socratic method is not about Socrates. It's about what happens when a mind chooses not to sleepwalk through its beliefs. When it chooses to ask even softly, even once, why do I think what I think? And then listens for the answer. Not in books, not in dogma, but in the trembling, flickering light of one's own imperfect thought. That's where he lived. That's where he still lives. Not in the past, but in every moment a person dares to be honest. The earlier tale rests now in stillness, its final words sinking into the quiet like stones, into deep water, leaving only the slow ripples of thought behind. The candle's flame sways gently, and in its light another journey begins, softer and wider, one that will drift through the great currents of philosophy, touching the ideas that have shaped the minds of centuries. No longer bound to one story, the mind will wander across 10 of the most enduring visions of wisdom, moving slowly so that each thought has time to settle like dust on an untouched shelf. Now let us speak of the first great idea, the Socratic method. It begins not with answers but with questions, small and deliberate, placed like stones on a path to see where they lead. Socrates believed that wisdom does not arrive in the fullness of knowing, but in the humility of realizing how little is truly known. He would meet his students not with lectures, but with simple inquiries, peeling away layers of certainty to reveal the soft, uncertain core beneath. Each answer invited another question, and in this unending dance the mind was forced to see its own contradictions, to stand in the open where assumptions once sheltered it. It is a method that is less about arriving somewhere than about refining the traveller, stripping away false confidence until only the essential remains. In the glow of this idea, one begins to feel the quiet power of conversation, not as a contest to win, but as a shared search where each voice is a lantern and the road ahead is always longer than it seems. Socrates himself left no writings, trusting instead in the living exchange between minds in the way a well-placed question can echo for years inside the heart. Even now, in the silence of this night, his method remains alive, for every honest question asked without the armour of certainty is a small act of Socratic courage, a way of stepping toward truth without claiming to possess it. And perhaps this is why his voice endures, not as the keeper of answers, but as the one who teaches how to walk in their direction. The candle leans, the air shifts, and somewhere in the darkness, the next great idea waits to be called forward. Now let us turn to the next great idea, Plato's theory of forms. Imagine a world beyond sight, untouched by time, where every shape, every truth, every beauty exists in its most perfect state. Plato believed that the reality we see is only a shadow of that higher realm, that the table in front of us is but an echo of the perfect tableness that exists beyond change, beyond decay. In this vision, the physical world is a mirror clouded by imperfection, and what we call knowledge is the act of remembering what the soul has already seen before birth. He spoke of a cave where people sit chained, watching shadows on a wall, believing them to be all there is, until one escapes into the light and sees the forms directly. The journey is not easy. The eyes ache in the brightness. The heart resists the unfamiliar. And yet once truth is glimpsed, the shadows lose their hold. In the forms lies the unchanging essence of things, the perfect circle that no hand can draw, the justice that no law can fully capture, the beauty that no face can forever keep. The senses, Plato warns, can deceive. They show us many chairs, each flawed, yet through thought we can approach the single, flawless form of chairness that makes them all possible. And so the philosopher's work is to look beyond appearances, to use reason as a bridge to that higher reality, to anchor the soul in what cannot fade. It is a comforting thought that somewhere there is a place where nothing breaks, nothing dies, nothing loses its shape, that all goodness and truth are preserved whole. But it is also a demanding thought, for it asks the mind to see the world not as an end, but as a clue, a path, a whisper of something greater. In this way, every ordinary thing becomes a signpost, every imperfect moment a reminder that perfection exists elsewhere, drawing us on. And perhaps in quiet moments like this, we can almost sense it, not with the eyes, but with the still part of the soul that recognizes what it once knew. The candle burns steadily, casting its own shadows on the wall, and one wonders which world this light belongs to, the one of change or the one of forms. Perhaps both. Perhaps every flicker is an invitation to turn toward the light. Now let us speak of Aristotle's virtue ethics, a vision of the good life not built on rigid rules or fleeting pleasures, but on the cultivation of character. Aristotle saw human life as a movement toward eudaimonia, a word often softened into happiness, but more deeply meaning human flourishing, the full flowering of one's nature. This is not a state one stumbles into by fortune, but a way of living shaped by countless choices, each one forming the habits that become the soul's architecture. Virtue, to Aristotle, is the balance between extremes, the golden mean between excess and deficiency. Courage lies between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity lies between wastefulness and stinginess. Honesty lies between boastfulness and self-deprecation. These are not mathematical midpoints, but living balances, different for each person, found through experience, reflection, and the slow refining of judgment. One becomes virtuous as one learns to play an instrument, not by reading notes alone, but by practice, by the feel of the strings, by mistakes that teach the hand where to rest. It is a philosophy that respects action, for knowing the good is not enough if one does not also do the good. And yet action must be guided by reason, for virtue is no accident. It is a harmony between thought and deed, where impulse is tempered by wisdom. In Aristotle's view, the virtuous person does the right thing not through struggle, but with a kind of ease as a skilled craftsman moves through his work with steady hands. Such ease is not born of laziness, but of long effort made natural. The world in this light is not a place to endure until some better life begins, but the very field in which the soul's excellence is cultivated. Every encounter, every challenge, every moment of choice is an opportunity to strengthen the fibre of one's being, and so The good life is not defined by wealth, power, or comfort, but by the steady accumulation of virtues, until the self stands as a well-built structure, able to weather the winds of fortune without collapse. In this way, happiness is not a prize, but the natural radiance of a well-shaped soul, a light that does not flicker with the passing of days. The candle's flame bends slightly in a whisper of unseen air, and one is reminded that balance, like virtue, is not stillness, but a constant adjustment, a living alignment with the good. Now let us turn to the thought of Descartes and the words that have echoed through centuries. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. It is a phrase born not from pride, but from doubt so deep it sought to strip away everything that could possibly be questioned, leaving only what could not be denied. Descartes imagined himself sweeping the mind clean of all assumption, pulling away the familiar scaffolding of belief until he stood alone in a vast space where nothing felt certain. Could the senses be trusted? They had deceived before. Could memories be trusted? They could be illusions. Could the body itself be trusted? Perhaps it was a dream, a trick, a fleeting projection. And yet, in the very act of doubting, one thing stood firm. There must be something that doubts. Thought itself became the bedrock, the one point that could not be faked or stolen. If thinking was happening, then something existed to do the thinking. This was not the end of his journey, but the first firm stone on which to build. From here, Descartes sought to rebuild the house of knowledge, brick by brick, each step tested for certainty. He wished for clarity as bright as geometry, truths so undeniable they could support all others. His method was deliberate, patient, as if sharpening a blade to cut away falsehood. And yet, there is something quietly human in the idea that the first certainty we can hold is the awareness of our own awareness, the strange fact that consciousness can turn inward and see itself. In the stillness of night, this feels less like a cold proof and more like a small ember glowing in the dark, a reminder that no matter how uncertain the world becomes, the flame of thought still burns. It is a solitary comfort, one that exists even when stripped of names, possessions, histories, even when all that remains is the bare knowing that we are here, now, thinking. Descartes' thought also whispers of the responsibility that comes with such certainty. If the self is known before all else, then it becomes the lens through which the world is built. A clear mind builds a clear life. A mind clouded with haste or fear builds a world that feels the same. To begin with, I think, is also to admit that the quality of thought matters, that the architecture of our inner world shapes the outer. The candle beside him might flicker, casting shifting shadows, but the fact of its light is undeniable. So too is the mind. Shadows may move across it, illusions may play on its surface, but the fact of its shining cannot be erased. In this way, cogito, ergo sum, is not a shout of triumph, but a steady breath in the silence, the quiet voice that remains when all other voices have been questioned away. It is the ground beneath the feet when the fog hides everything else, the one certainty from which all other certainties might grow. And perhaps, in the hours before sleep, when the body lies still and thought drifts, it is enough to hold this single truth without reaching for more, that in the act of thinking, of doubting, of wondering, there is existence, and in that existence, there is the beginning of all understanding. Now let us move to Kant's categorical imperative, a moral compass not drawn from desire or consequence, but from duty itself, pure and unbending. Kant asked what it would mean to act in such a way that one's choices could be made into universal law, binding for all in all places, at all times. He sought a morality that stood above preference, stronger than impulse, untouched by the shifting tides of personal gain. Imagine pausing before each act to ask, if everyone did this, could the world still stand? If the answer is no, the act must be set aside, however tempting, however small. This is the first face of the imperative, a rule that turns the mirror outward to humanity as a whole, asking the self to see its choices not as private shadows, but as patterns in a greater weave. The second face is equally stern, yet equally luminous. Treat every person as an end in themselves, never merely as a means. In this, Kant draws a line against using others as tools for one's own purposes, however noble the excuse. Each person is a whole world, not a rung on a ladder, and to honour that is to honour the dignity of reason itself. The beauty of this thought lies in its symmetry, one's own freedom bound only by the freedom of all others, the moral law arising not from command, but from the structure of thought that all rational beings share. In Kant's view, morality is not a gift from heaven nor a contract with society, but something woven into the very capacity to reason, a truth that would shine even in a universe empty of gods. And yet, he admits, to follow it is no easy task. Desire pulls like wind, fear presses like weight, and the clarity of the imperative can feel cold against the warmth of inclination. But for Kant, it is in that cold clarity that moral worth is found. For to act rightly when it costs nothing is no great proof of virtue, but to act rightly against one's own advantage is the mark of a will aligned with the moral law. There is a certain quiet majesty in this view, the thought that even in the smallest decision one participates in a law as vast and impartial as the night sky, each act a star in a constellation too large for one life to see whole. The candle on the desk leans lower, its flame steady despite the draught, and one is reminded that light does not ask whether it is convenient to shine, it simply fulfills its nature. In this, Kant's imperative finds its living image, a steady flame guided not by whim or reward, but by the form of its own being. Now let us drift into Nietzsche's vision of the will to power, a force he saw not as the hunger for mere control over others, but as the deep, restless impulse within all living things to grow, to expand, to overcome the boundaries of what they are. For Nietzsche, life itself was a movement toward more life, a ceaseless reaching, like roots pressing through stone, or rivers carving valleys over centuries. The will to power was not simply ambition, nor the shallow thirst for domination, but the inner current that drives the seed to become a tree, the artist to create beyond exhaustion, the thinker to break the limits of inherited truth. In his eyes, existence was not content to remain still. It surged forward in infinite forms, testing itself, reshaping itself, becoming more than it was. Even suffering could be part of this will, for struggle was not a mark of weakness, but a forge where strength was tempered. To embrace the will to power was to see life not as a series of obstacles, to endure until rest, but as a great arena in which one's being was sharpened through challenge, conflict, and creation. He warned against the life lived too safely, for in the shelter from hardship, the will could wither, becoming timid and pale. Better, he thought, to step into the storm and find in it the raw material from which to build oneself anew. It was this idea that fed his vision of the Übermensch, the one who creates their own values, standing beyond the dictates of the herd, shaping a self as an artist shapes stone, not with submission, but with the courage to carve. Such a life was not without cost. It demanded the abandonment of illusions that comfort but weaken, the acceptance that meaning is not given but made. Yet in this creation, the will to power finds its highest form, not in ruling over others, but in ruling over the self, in mastering the chaos within and turning it toward a work of art that is one's own existence. The night deepens as the thought settles, and one can feel in its quiet insistence the truth Nietzsche sensed, that even in stillness, the will stirs like embers beneath ash, waiting for the breath that will bring them back into flame. Now let us turn to the idea of utilitarianism, the quiet yet weighty belief that the right action is the one that brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number. It is a thought that moves like a measuring hand over every choice, weighing pleasure against pain, joy against sorrow, as if morality itself could be shaped into a delicate balance. Jeremy Bentham spoke of it first in clear, almost mathematical terms, imagining each decision as a calculation, a sum of benefit and harm. John Stuart Mill refined it, reminding that not all pleasures are equal, that the delight of the mind and the depth of the heart stand above the fleeting gratifications of the body. In this way, the principle grows from mere arithmetic into a philosophy of care, one that asks not simply, "What do I want?" but "What will ease the burdens of all?" And yet, there is a softness in its ambition, for it does not dream of perfect worlds or flawless virtue, only of the steady increase of well-being, the lessening of needless suffering. In the quiet of night, such a thought has a certain tenderness, a recognition that life is already heavy and that the best we can do is to make it lighter where we can. But utilitarianism is not without its shadows. To weigh happiness is to sometimes choose between lives, to accept that what benefits the many may wound the few, and this calculation can cut deeply into the fabric of moral certainty. It demands a coolness of mind that can seem at odds with the warmth of compassion, and yet it is driven by compassion's root desire, that pain be less and joy be more. One might picture it as a lantern carried through a dark field, its light cast not just for the carrier, but for all who walk nearby. Each act becomes a ripple in a still pond, spreading outward in rings unseen, touching lives never met. To live by such a rule is to be always aware of these ripples, to choose with an eye not on the self alone, but on the widening circle of effect. In this way, the smallest kindness becomes great, and the smallest cruelty becomes grave. The candle's flame dips, sways, then steadies again, and one can almost feel in that fragile steadiness the essence of this thought, that the good is not a single blaze, but the gentle work of keeping the light burning for as many as it can reach. Now let us drift into the realm of existentialism, a philosophy that stands in the quiet space between the vast indifference of the universe and the fragile beating of a human heart. Kierkegaard spoke of the leap, the choice to believe or to act in the face of uncertainty, while Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, that we are not born with a fixed nature, but must carve our own from the raw stone of being. In this vision, there is no script, no eternal blueprint waiting to be discovered, only the open field of freedom, both exhilarating and heavy with the weight of responsibility. For to be free is also to be without excuse. Every choice, even the refusal to choose, shapes the meaning of one's life. Camus saw this clearly in the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push the boulder without end, yet free to find joy in the act itself, to turn the burden into a form of defiance. In existentialism, the meaning of life is not given but made, shaped moment by moment in the furnace of decision. It is a philosophy that does not shy from the darkness. It asks us to stand within it and light our own small flame, knowing it may be the only one. This freedom can be dizzying, for the mind longs for certainty, for a map, for a guiding star that will not fade. Yet existentialism whispers that no such star is fixed, that we must chart the heavens ourselves, and that in doing so we become the cartographers of our own reality. Even despair in this light can be transformed, for when nothing is predetermined, every step becomes a declaration, every act a creation. The candle on the table burns without asking why. Its purpose is found in the burning itself. So too with life. Its meaning may be nothing more than the living of it, and yet in that simple truth lies a strange and unshakable dignity. To live without guarantees is to walk a path that is fully one's own, and in that ownership there is both solitude and strength. Perhaps this is why, in the quiet hours, existentialism feels less like a burden and more like a permission, the permission to be, to choose, to shape, and to stand as the sole author of one's fleeting but luminous story. Now let us move into the idea of the social contract, the quiet yet binding thread that weaves individuals into the fabric of a society. Hobbes spoke of a world before such a contract, a state of nature where life, though free, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, where each lived by strength or cunning, and safety was a fragile dream. To escape this chaos, people, he said, surrendered certain freedoms, placing them in the hands of a sovereign power in exchange for order and protection. Locke's vision was gentler, imagining the contract as a guardian of life, liberty, and property, with the right to replace rulers who broke its trust. Rousseau heard another note entirely, speaking of the general will, the shared interest that rises above individual desires, the possibility of a collective self that acts not to oppress but to free. In each telling, the contract is not a paper in a drawer, but a living agreement, renewed in every act of cooperation, every law obeyed or challenged, every moment where self-interest bends toward the common good. It is unseen yet everywhere, shaping the streets we walk, the words we speak, the trust with which we open our doors at night. Without it, the world would return to the scattered silence of fear, where each step must be guarded and every stranger is a threat. Yet with it comes the weight of obligation, for to be part of a society is to bear the responsibility of maintaining its justice, to give as well as to take, to remember that rights are not solitary possessions, but shared inheritances. The candle burns lower, its light touching the edges of the room, and one feels in that circle the shape of the contract itself, an agreement to keep the flame alive so that all may see. But contracts, like flames, are delicate. They require care, they demand the tending of truth, the protection of fairness, the vigilance against those who would twist the common good to private ends. And so, to honour the social contract is not only to live within its safety, but to guard its spirit, to ensure that the promise made long ago in silence still holds in the lives of those who have never spoken it aloud. Now let us wander into the ancient current of the Tao, the way, the quiet path spoken of in the old verses of Lao Tzu, a path not built but discovered, not forced but followed. The Tao is the rhythm beneath all rhythms, the flowing order that needs no command, the movement of clouds and rivers, the unfurling of leaves, the turning of the seasons, all in harmony, without hurry. To walk with the Tao is to let go of the restless urge to control, to see that the world shapes itself without the heavy hand of constant interference. The sages called this Wu Wei, effortless action. Not idleness, but the art of doing in a way that does not fight the current. It is the tree bending in the wind rather than breaking, the stream finding its way, a round stone without force. The Tao is not a destination, but the living present. Not a doctrine, but the quiet awareness that each moment holds its own completeness. It asks no oaths, no declarations, only the soft attentiveness that notices the pattern already unfolding. One who follows the Tao is like water, yielding yet unstoppable, clear yet deep, seeking the low places others avoid, nourishing without demanding. This way of being does not deny desire, but it does not cling to it. It does not refuse action, but it does not wrestle with it. In this light, ambition is not abandoned, but transformed, becoming less about climbing and more about flowing, less about conquest and more about harmony. The candle flickers with a small shift in the air, its flame swaying but not going out. A small lesson in the Tao itself, movement without loss, change without destruction. To understand the Tao is to see that control is an illusion, that the greatest strength often lies in yielding, that the world's deepest wisdom moves quietly, without announcement, shaping mountains and lives alike in its patient course. And so the way is always here, as near as the breath, as silent as the stars, waiting only for the stillness in which it can be heard. Now let us drift into David Hume's quiet yet unsettling thought, the problem of induction, a gentle unthreading of the trust we place in the patterns of the world. From childhood, we are taught to expect that the sun will rise tomorrow because it rose today, that bread will nourish because it always has, that dropped stones will fall because they always do. But Hume asked, how can we truly know this? We have seen these patterns repeat, yes, but repetition is not proof. We believe the future will mirror the past, not because of reason, but because of habit, a habit so deep it feels like certainty. We watch cause and effect as though they are bound together by necessity, yet what we actually see is only one thing following another, again and again, until the mind weaves its own invisible thread between them. We never witness the binding itself, only the sequence, only the rhythm. In this way, our confidence in tomorrow rests on an assumption we cannot prove, and yet cannot live without. Hume did not mean to strip the world of trust, but to show that our trust is a creature of the mind, not the logic of the universe. This thought can feel like standing at the edge of a vast plain at night, knowing the path forward is only lit by the small lantern of memory, and the rest is darkness we simply step into, believing the ground will still be there. The beauty of Hume's insight lies in its humility, for it reminds us that knowledge is not as solid as we wish it to be, that certainty is a quiet agreement between experience and expectation. Even the candle beside us burns with the same illusion. We expect it will keep burning in the next moment, but this is only because it has burned in the last. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't, but our life moves forward as though it must. In this space between proof and habit, between knowledge and trust, Hume leaves us not with despair, but with the awareness that the mind's faith in the future is one of its most fragile and necessary acts. Now let us wander into the old and tempting vision of hedonism, the belief that pleasure is the highest good, that the measure of a life is found in the fullness of its delights. To the ancient Greeks, it was not a call to endless indulgence, but a search for the truest forms of happiness, the kind that endure rather than vanish in the aftertaste of excess. Epicurus spoke of it as the art of seeking pleasure wisely, of choosing those joys that do not bring pain in their shadow, of cultivating the simple satisfactions that need no wealth or conquest to sustain them. For him, bread and water could be a feast if taken with peace of mind, and friendship, quiet and deep, was a treasure greater than gold. In this light, pleasure was not the frantic grasping at sensation, but the gentle shaping of life, to avoid unnecessary suffering, to find contentment in what is near at hand. Yet hedonism holds a mirror to a truth many resist. That pain is the weight we seek to set down, and joy is the lightness we seek to carry. To follow this path is to learn the difference between what pleases in the moment and what nourishes across time, to see that the richest pleasures are often the softest ones, like the warmth of the sun on closed eyelids or the sound of rain against a window. But there is danger here too, for the pursuit of pleasure can so easily drift into a hunger that is never sated, a chasing of peaks that leaves one hollow between them. This is why the wiser hedonists speak of balance, of knowing when to stop, of savouring rather than consuming. The candle burns with a steady glow, giving its light freely but within the limits of its wax. It does not seek to burn faster, for that would be to end itself. So too with pleasure, when it is taken in measure, it sustains; when taken in greed, it destroys. Hedonism, at its truest, is the art of knowing the difference. Now let us move into the deep and endless question of determinism and free will, the tension between the chains of cause and the dream of choice. Determinism whispers that every action, every thought, every breath is the inevitable result of all that came before, that the universe is a vast, unbroken chain stretching backward to the first movement and forward to the last, each link forged by the one before it. In this view, the moment of decision is not a birth but an unfolding, like a seed opening because it must, like the tide rising because it is pulled. If the mind is shaped by genes, by upbringing, by the precise arrangement of atoms and events, then perhaps even the belief in freedom is simply another link in the chain. And yet, against this, the feeling of choice rises like a stubborn flame. The sense of standing at a crossroads, of being able to step left or right, to speak or remain silent, to act or to refrain. Free will insists that within the machinery there is a space, however small, where the self can push against the weight of what has been and make something new. Some see the two not as enemies but as different lights on the same river, that perhaps the current is fixed, yet the way one moves within it is one's own, that freedom may lie not in altering the flow, but in choosing how to meet it. Others suggest that even if all is determined, the experience of choosing is real enough to live by, for a life lived as if one is free is shaped differently than one lived in resignation. The candle on the table burns because the match was struck. The match was struck because the hand moved. The hand moved because of thoughts. The thoughts arose because of other moments, each leading to this small circle of light. Whether this flame was inevitable from the birth of the stars or lit by a free and sudden act may never be known. Perhaps it is in the mystery between these two that human life unfolds, a dance of necessity and possibility, where even if the steps are written, the dancer still moves with grace. Now let us step into the quiet puzzle of the ship of Theseus, an ancient question that drifts between the harbours of identity and change. The story is simple. A ship preserved in honour of a hero is kept seaworthy for centuries by replacing its parts as they decay. First a plank, then a mast, then the sails, until every single piece is new. And so the question arises, when all the original parts are gone, is it still the same ship? At first it feels like a trick of language, but the longer one lingers, the deeper it pulls. For if the ship is not the same, then at what moment did it cease to be itself? Was it when the first plank was replaced, or the last? And if it is the same, then what makes it so? The form, the function, the name, or something else entirely? The puzzle grows stranger still when one imagines the discarded pieces gathered and rebuilt into a ship identical to the original. Which then is the true ship of Theseus, the one with the unbroken history, or the one made of the original wood? The candle flame quivers slightly, and one realizes that the question is not only about ships but about people, for our bodies too are replaced piece by piece as the years turn, cells dying and being born, memories fading and shifting, beliefs evolving, faces changing. Yet we say without hesitation, I am still myself. Perhaps identity is not the matter from which we are made, but the continuity of the journey, the thread of experience and memory woven through time. Or perhaps we are, like the ship, something that both changes completely and remains somehow whole, our essence not fixed but a living thing, shaped and reshaped by the tides of existence. In this way, the ship of Theseus is less a riddle to be solved than a mirror, quietly reflecting the mystery of what it means to remain oneself while becoming someone new. Now let us rest within the strange and quiet terrain of absurdism, the recognition, as Albert Camus saw it, that human beings are creatures who seek meaning in a universe that offers none in return. The mind yearns for clarity, for a grand design, for a purpose written in the stars, yet when it looks outward, it meets only silence, a vast and unbroken stillness. This is the absurd, not chaos, not hostility, but the endless tension between the hunger for meaning and the absence of it. Many, upon feeling this weight, rush to escape it, turning to faith, ideology, or distraction, anything to stitch a pattern into the blank cloth of existence. But Camus suggested another way, to face the absurd without flinching, to accept that life is without ultimate explanation, and yet to live it fully intensely, as though the lack of meaning were not a prison, but a kind of freedom. In his image of Sisyphus pushing the stone, he saw not a figure crushed by futility, but one who, in embracing the endless task, finds his own victory. If there is no higher plan, then each moment becomes the canvas, and we, the painters of its fleeting colours. The candle's flame, which will inevitably burn down to nothing, still gives its light in this moment, and that light is enough. Absurdism asks not for resignation, but for defiance, not the bitter defiance of rage, but the quiet defiance of joy, the choice to smile in the face of the void. It whispers that life's worth is not hidden behind some distant curtain to be drawn back at the end, but here, in the very act of living, in the taste of water, in the warmth of a shared glance, in the sound of wind moving through leaves at night. And so, one learns to walk through the silence with open eyes, to push the stone with steady hands, knowing that the meaning one seeks may never come, and yet finding, in the seeking itself, something that feels like meaning after all. Now let us enter the shadowed depths of Plato's allegory of the cave, a vision of human understanding drawn in the soft charcoal of myth. Imagine a group of people who have lived their whole lives chained in darkness, their faces turned toward a wall, able to see only the flickering shadows cast by objects passing before a fire behind them. To these prisoners, the shadows are the only reality, the shapes the only truth, for they have never seen the objects themselves, nor the fire, nor the world beyond the cave. Then imagine that one prisoner is freed, pulled into the light, stumbling and blinded at first. For the truth is painful when the eyes have known only darkness. Slowly, shapes emerge. The fire, the path upward, and finally, beyond the cave, the vast and radiant world under the open sky. Trees, water, sunlight, stars. In that moment, the freed one understands that all they had believed was but a pale reflection of something greater. Yet the allegory does not end there, for the freed prisoner feels the pull to return, to descend again into the cave and tell the others of what lies beyond. But the others, unaccustomed to such talk, may not believe, may even resist, for the comfort of familiar shadows can feel safer than the blinding strangeness of truth. Plato's vision is not only about knowledge, but about the soul's journey from illusion to reality and the cost of awakening. For to see the light is also to know the darkness for what it is, and to live with the burden of both. The candle on the table flickers, casting soft shadows on the wall, and one can feel the cave in them, the way perception can be bound by what the senses allow, the way truth often waits beyond the frame of sight. The allegory whispers that each life is a kind of cave, and that to seek wisdom is to climb toward the light, even if the ascent is slow, even if the sun's brightness brings tears, even if the ones left below cannot follow. Now let us move into the still centre of Aristotle's golden mean, the gentle balance he saw as the heart of virtue, the narrow path between the cliffs of excess and deficiency. For Aristotle, every virtue is a midpoint, not an exact line drawn in stone, but a living balance that shifts with circumstance and person. Courage lies between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between miserliness and waste, humility between arrogance and self-abasement. It is not the avoidance of extremes for their own sake, but the seeking of the place where equality is at its most fitting, most human, most whole. This balance is not static, for life moves, and with it the measure of the mean. What is courage in one moment may be recklessness in another. What is restraint today may be cowardice tomorrow. The golden mean asks for a constant listening, a steady attunement to the harmony of the situation, as a musician adjusts each note to the flow of the music. In this way, virtue becomes less a rigid rule and more a craft, something shaped with patience and care, a skill honed in the quiet decisions that fill the days. Yet to live in balance is not to live without passion, Aristotle did not call for the dull flattening of all feeling, but for the full flowering of what is good in its right place and measure. The candle burns at such a mean, too small a flame, and it will fade into darkness, too large, and it will consume itself. But here it glows steadily, giving light and warmth without waste. The golden mean is a reminder that wisdom often lives, not in the loud gesture or the final extreme, but in the quiet middle, where the forces of life meet and steady each other. And so, to walk in virtue is to walk that narrow yet shifting road, feeling the weight of each step, listening for the place where one stands in harmony with both the self and the world. Now let us drift into the quiet logic of the principle of sufficient reason, the thought that nothing exists without a reason why it is so and not otherwise. Leibniz shaped it into a guiding light for the mind, a soft but unyielding demand that every fact, every event, every shadow and star carries within it the thread of its own explanation. To accept this principle is to believe that the world is not scattered chaos, but an ordered tapestry, each stitch bound to the next by the necessity, of course, the inevitability of reason. Yet this is not only a law for the scientist or the philosopher, it is the silent pull that makes a child ask why again and again, the impulse to peer behind the curtain of the obvious, to lift the stone and see what lives beneath. It whispers that no leaf falls without a cause, no thought rises in the mind without its roots, no flame burns without the marriage of air and spark. The candle before us is here because the wax was shaped, the wick was set, the match was struck. The air allowed it to live, each step a reason, each reason part of a longer chain that winds back beyond sight. But the principle carries its own shadows, for if everything must have a reason, then what reason is there for the whole of existence itself? What stands at the end of the chain, giving reason to all, yet needing none? Leibniz answered with the idea of a necessary being, something whose reason for existing lies in its own nature, something that simply is. Others see in this the limits of reason itself, a place where the mind meets the horizon and can go no further. Still, the principle remains a lantern in the dark, guiding thought through the tangled forest of causes, reminding us that to understand is to search for the thread that binds each moment to another, even if in the end that thread disappears into the silence from which all things come. Now let us sink into the shadowed waters of nihilism, the unsettling recognition that life may hold no inherent meaning, no ultimate purpose written into its fabric. The word carries the chill of emptiness, yet its roots lie not in the desire to destroy, but in the willingness to strip away illusions, to stand before the world without the shelter of comforting fictions. Nietzsche spoke of it as both a danger and a beginning. For when the old beliefs crumble, when the foundations that once seemed eternal turn to dust, a vast space opens. Some see in that space only despair, a void into which all values collapse, a darkness in which the self drifts without anchor. Yet others find in it a strange liberation, the freedom to shape meaning rather than receive it, to become the author rather than the subject of life's story. Nihilism does not erase the sun or silence the wind. It changes only the frame in which they're seen. The candle's flame still burns, though it owes its light to nothing beyond itself. And in that self-contained glow, there is a quiet beauty. To live without inherent meaning is not to live without value. It is to understand that value is made, not found, woven from choice, from love, from the small acts of creation that give colour to the days. The danger comes when the void is mistaken for an end rather than a beginning, when the absence of given purpose is read as the absence of all purpose. But for those who can bear the weight of it, nihilism becomes not a sentence, but a horizon, a wide and open space where the individual stands in the stillness and begins to speak meaning into the silence. It is a call to live, not because life is guaranteed to matter, but because it can be made to matter. and in that making lies a kind of quiet triumph. Now let us step into the looping corridor of Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the thought experiment that bends time into a circle and asks the soul to dwell within it. Imagine that one night, in the stillness of solitude, a voice comes to whisper that every moment of life, every breath, every joy and sorrow will return to you again and again, not once, not twice, but endlessly, exactly as it has unfolded before. Each gesture repeated, each word spoken again, each glance, each mistake, each triumph, forever. At first, the thought may feel like a weight, an unbearable burden, the idea that even the smallest pains will be lived not only once but countless times. Yet Nietzsche posed it not as a curse but as a test, a mirror held to the heart to ask, if this were true, could one embrace it? Could one say yes to the totality of existence, to the light and the shadow, the sweetness and the bitterness, as if they were inseparable notes in the same music? To live as though the eternal recurrence were real is to live without reservation, to choose each act as if it were to echo across eternity, to stand before life and affirm it wholly without wishing a single moment away. The candle before us burns with the same silent repetition. Each flicker is both new and the same, a dance of light that will appear and vanish in countless forms, yet always aflame. The idea does not demand belief in a literal cycle. It asks instead whether one can meet life with such depth of acceptance that even if all returned forever, nothing in it would be denied. It is a call to live so completely that time itself, in its endless turning, would become not a prison, but a celebration, a circle one would step into again and again, not in resignation, but in joy.